Heat shimmered in the rafters above the anvil, and the small sounds of the street, the cry of a fishmonger, the hiss and spit of a kettle trundled past on a brazier, died at the threshold like oathbreakers turned back by iron and fire. In Tobo Mat's forge the world narrowed to coal and bellows, to a boy's dark head bent close over a glowing bar, to the low thunder of a hammer drawn from its rest and lifted with practiced arms. The light found the boy's cheekbones, and the sweat that clung there made his eyes brighter than the steel. He did not look up when the hand of the king stepped from heat and shadow, his gray cloak sifting motes of ash like new snow falling in summer. Eddard Stark watched the boy shape the metal's stubborn heat with an impersonal patience that had always reminded him of the North. No guastid motion. No vanity in the work, just the task, and the task to be done well. Mott had spoken of him in the oily voice of a man proud of his inventory but wary of overpraising. A big boy, strong in the arms, quick with his hands, sullen if pressed, a good memory for shape and weight, an eye for a true edge. It was not any of that tangled a net around Ned Stark's heart when he first saw the boy's face full on. It was memory. Lyanna, I have found him, Ned thought, and the thought felt like blasphemy and relief at once. No winter rose, this. No whisper-fine petal in a bed of frost. The boy's features were stamped deep, bold as if struck by a king's seal. Black hair thick as a boar's back, a chin like a boulder, eyes the color of a storm in the bite. Robert in the days when they were boys, before wine and grief had rounded him, before the weight of a crown had sloped his shoulders. The old words struck like the hammer. The seed is strong. The hammer paused at last. The boy lifted the reddened length to the light, turned it, listened. He touched the metal to the edge of the anvil, and the hiss of tempering was the whisper of summer rain. Only then did he glance up, and seeing strangers, the Lord of Winterfell himself, the black and gold cloak of a king's guard at his shoulder. His mouth thinned, and his eyes narrowed, but he did not bow. He looked at Tobo Mat first, and then at the Northern Lord as he might look at a confidant, a tool, a problem. Gendry, Mat said with a little clap of his hands. Mind your tongue and put away that piece. You have guests and not the common kind. Lord Eddard Stark, hand to the king. The boy wiped his hands on his apron. He had a smith's hands already, big and nicked and raw, the knuckles chafed white by leather and heat. He set the bar to rest as if it were a living thing that might take umbrage at being flung aside. Only then did he nod to a lord who had knelt before the old gods in the cold of many winters. My lord, he said, and it was grudging but honest. Ned stepped closer. He smelled coal and iron and sweat, and underneath it, something faintly clean. The resin washed from a bundle of kindling, the bite of green wood. The boy's eyes were like Robert's as he tracked the shape of Ned's sword hilt, the cut of his boots, the little scar at the hand's wrist from a long-ago hunt. In that gaze was hunger, the quiet hunger of a boy who measured the world by weight and use. How old are you? Ned asked. 15, Gendry said, and a flicker of pride accompanied it, as if he weighed himself and found he bettered the worth set on him. Your mother? Ned did not know why he asked. He had never asked Robert's bastards their mother's names before. In all the years of late, he had never gone to look at them. That had been Jon Arryn's pity and duty. Gendry's mouth flicked. Dead. She worked in a tavern you'd not have gone to. Maybe you'd have sent a man. Someone paid for him, Tobo Mat said quickly, as if his forge were a pool he meant to keep still and clear. Well paid. I was told to keep the boy here till he was master enough to be his own man. There were questions, once. I sent them off with a flea in their breeches. Ned heard Varys before the spider's soft shoes had made a sound. That was the man's trick, to set your knowledge hoarding up against you earlier than his arrival. Your mercy extends to the common-born, Lord Stark. Varys murmured just inside the gloom. I have seldom seen a hand at a forge unless it was to hire a blade. This is a boy. Ned's voice surprised him with its finality. And I will see him send no more men away with fleas. Gendry's eyes had not left his face. Somewhere in the castle a bell tolled. It was not the one for prayer. It sounded like a coin struck wrong on the die. Ned let it fade. He thought of Jon Arryn's fingers at his sleeve, of the hand coughing blood and trying to speak a word around it. Blue, he had wanted to say, or black or strong. Gendry, Ned said, and the boy straightened as if the syllables themselves had weight. You work hard, and I am told you learn. Lord Tobo counts the coin men will press into his hand when you wear his apron's chain. I would have you before then. No free man is sold, but if you wish it, I will take you into my household and call you son to me. I will take you north where the work is clean and the air sharp enough to wake you from a drunken slumber. You'll see snow and learn frost has a language. You will have a hammer in your hands as long as your arm holds to it. Mott made a chastened sound. My lord. Gendry's eyes flared and then narrowed. You'd call me son? He asked, not with wonder, but with suspicion sharpened on old mockery. Why? The truth was a river that could drown the both of them. Ned let it shift under his tongue. Because I can, he said, plain. Because a lord ought to take his duties where he finds them, and you are a duty set before me. If he is to go north, Varys cooed, it is better soon. The city is hungry for kings and their children. A simple boy may not survive a feast. His lashes fell soft and slow. You do remember what a feast looks like, Lord Stark? Ned thought of Robert reeling into the council chamber with boar's blood on his boots and wine at his chin. He thought of Cersei's smile poised like a blade on a sheath. He thought of the book Jon Arryn had held between tremoring fingers, genealogies that smelled of dust and the certainty of ink. The seed is strong, and kings die. Soon, Ned said. Today. Gendry laughed, short and unkind to himself. It's hot today. It is, Ned conceded. Winter is coming. The boy's mouth pressed into a line. He looked past Ned to Mott, to the tong rack, to the half-shaped iron on the anvil. He looked back to Ned as if weighing the man in the same hand as the metal. I'll go, he said at last. Only I don't know your gods. They will learn you in time, Ned said. He paid Tobo Mott in silver scaled by courtesy, and in another coin measured by the quiet glance he spared Varys. The spider smiled like a curtain closing. By dusk, the boy had a cloak someone had outgrown and a pack that smelled of the tannery. And he stood on the back stairs of the Tower of the Hand with an expression Ned knew better than most men know their own faces. It was the expression of a boy not weaned off hunger and pride and the thought that the world would break before he bent. It had been Robert's once, like a bright pennant in the wind. You will not be heir, Ned told him without preface. You will not be the first I name when the lists are read. That does not decide the shape of love in a house. In Winterfell, we have room for boys who are not first. Gendry's gaze flinched toward the thought of the someone else, and regret flickered. Telling that truth was like pressing a blade to fruit. It parted as if ready, yet the juice made a mess of the fingers. Ned remembered Jon, silent and pale in the dawn of the day he rode for the wall, the way he had not looked back for fear of the looking breaking him. Duty is the death of love, Catelyn had said in her steel voice more than once, but love did not die. It turned and changed shape and insisted. I never asked for a place, Gendry said. No, Ned rested his hand on the boy's shoulder and felt a forge's heat there still. That is why you shall have one. They left by night so clean it felt false, the stars like glass beads strewn over velvet. Ned sent a dozen of his household men with a carter and a covered wain for plausible goods. They wore the colors of no house. They were to ride as far as the crossroads and then take the east track that bent north as if ashamed of the capital, then the river road through the Bar-Rollins, then the long green route up to Winterfell, with stops where men would be remembered for paying fairly and seldom for talking. Jory Castle argued to come until Ned forbade it. Jory was too fine a captain to be spared, too much a bright banner, and Ned loved him besides. Harwin went. He had a way of speaking to horses that soothed their pride. Tomard went. His size could frighten men from the wain without a word. The boy sat at the back of the cart, hands on his knees, a hammer wrapped in linen at his side. He did not speak until the city fell behind them and dawn began to lift like a pale coin minted new. What do I call you? He asked. He had called him my lord every time before, and the formality had been a shield held up at every distance. Ned looked at him. "If it suits, you may call me Lord in public," he said, and then, after a pause in which he felt the quibbling of a child and the stubbornness of a man wrestle within him, "and Father when it doesn't." Gendry frowned as if trying a new tool. "I'll try it once," he muttered, "to see if it bites." "It will," Ned said, surprised into gentleness. Most true things do. The city shrank behind them with its walls and its stink, with its gold cloaks and gossip, with its queen gilded like a poisoned apple. The road unrolled, a ribbon traced through scrub and old hedgerows and streams silver in the dawn. Ned rode 2 days with them, long enough to see that Gendry had the legs for distance and the sense to keep his mouth closed and his eyes open, that he spoke kindly to small folk without making them bow lower than they must, that he could wait at a ford without growing into a stew of impatience. He grew quieter as the capital's grime burned from his lungs. On the 3rd day, Ned turned back. King Robert would return from the hunt soon. Matters could not be left to their own coiling. He stood with Gendry in the lee of a hayshed, the air full of mice scratch and old straw, and passed him a small roll of parchment sealed with his seal. The wax caught a glint of waterlight. "For the maester at Winterfell," he said, feeling the old gods watching from whatever trees watched Southlands. "If the road turns strange, if a black dog follows you or a good man's eyes go cloudy, you give this to the first honest hand you find." Gendry turned the seal in his fingers. "I'm not much for letters." "Nor am I," Ned said. "We will both do our best." He watched them ride out until the dust took them. When last he saw the boy's head, it was black against a field of barley turned by the wind. By the time the wain rattled beneath Winterfell's long shadow weeks later, autumn had gathered itself in the woods like a story drawing breath. The air had teeth. The stones of the castle held their own heat in dreams, steaming when sun kissed them. The stables smelled of hay and horse and crisp apples. A raven's cry blew down from the first keep and shattered on the yard stones. Catelyn stood on the steps with Maester Luwin and Ser Roderick Castle, with Bran at her side and Rickon halfway behind her skirts. Robb had the yard in his stride before the wain stopped, Theon Greyjoy at his shoulder, their laughter rising and breaking like surf as the dogs bayed. The boys had been racing hounds the length of the yard. In their wind-burned faces and snow-blown hair, Ned saw the north stirring itself like a bear at the edge of a long sleep. He felt the lack of Sansa's carefully composed courtesies, of Arya's tang of wildness. He felt how absence was a shape in itself. The carter climbed down, tugged his forelock, and then Gendry did too, dropping to the yard with the easy balance of a boy who had learned not to trip over his own strength. His eyes climbed the walls and the towers like a smith sizing a piece for flaws, and for a moment something as simple as awe undid his caution. The sound that escaped him was small and full and unpracticed. It made Robb grin. "You're the smith," Robb called, taking the steps down 2 at a time. "Mikken will not like it, not one bit. But he will like strong arms, and I would like a new point on my boar spear before the snows are hard." Gendry blinked at the heir of Winterfell, at the easy command, at the other boy with sea-gray eyes and a smirk like a knife's shimmer, Theon, it had to be, leaning at his shoulder. He looked then to Catelyn, who had come down 2 steps and no more. Her gaze was as level as a yard rule. "This is Gendry," Maester Luwin supplied, already reading the seal Ned had sent. "From King's Landing. Eddard writes to say that he comes as his son." As his son rustled the leaves of the yard, it went through them like cold. Robb's brows went up, mischief and interest warring. Bran's round, solemn face opened like a door. Theon gave a low whistle under his breath and made a face Catelyn had often smacked from little boys' mouths. "As his son," Catelyn echoed, and she knew how her voice sounded. Smooth as ice in the pail, the papers bore Ned's seal. Ned had written no explanations in a hand she could read thrice in the time it took another to puzzle once. She had been a Tully trained in currents. She saw all the little things at once. The boy's hair like a raven's wing, the breadth of shoulder, the square of jaw, and under that, the gap he would fill. Jon's old shadow moved through winter sunlight and made her cold in a way her furs could not warm. "Winterfell has always had room," she said at last, and it was true. "You shall have a place here. We show our boys their places early, so they grow into them without too much knocking their heads on lintels." Gendry's frown was an answer. It held a hint of a bow that had yet to be taught to his spine, and it was not disrespectful, only stubborn. He glanced at Robb and Bran and then back to Catelyn as if asking who would decide where his bed stood. "I'll work," he said. "That's what I know." "Work is well thought of here," Maester Luwin said, his thin mouth making a gentle shape. "Mikken will see to you." Mikken saw to him by setting him to sweeping ash and hauling bar stock and matching a pile of bent nails. The smith was barrel-chested and sour as salted apple peel, proud of his work and jealous of his forge, and it was hours before he would be tricked into asking to see the boy set a shoulder to the bellows. He had a nose for fraud. It was red-veined and blunt and pointed where it sniffed. Gendry did not preen or boast. He let his hands speak. By the time the first snow drifted down like stray feathers from a split bolster, Mikken had handed over the hammer with a grunt that was almost a blessing. Gendry slept under a eave at first, then moved to a room near the smithy where the stone carried heat different from the stone of the main tower, the kind of warmth that clung to you almost against your will. He learned the smell of the god's wood, which was frost and black earth and a resin so clean it made his teeth ache. He learned the names of lungs in weather: cutting, knife, needle, slice. He learned the kitchen girls had their own gods, and they were flour and grease and no fear of a boy with a black look. The dogs knew him as a new hand that never smelled of horse. In the yard, when Robb laughed or Bran fell and then laughed harder because the fall had not broken him, Gendry found his mouth curving of its own accord. It took longer for him to find a word for the woman who moved through Winterfell like a white line in a dark weave. He had known women who were quick-fingered and quicker-tongued, smells of ale and sweat and cheap soap wrapped about them like their own kind of cloak. Catelyn Stark did not smell of anything he knew. She smelled of cold water and wool and the stone room where she prayed to gods who would not listen to a boy like him. He said as much to Harwin once, and the horseman smiled with a melancholy only the truly kind ever had. "Lady Catelyn prays to gods who listen to men of their own sort," Harwin said, and then paused. "But you are the Lord's son." She is trying to square it. "I'm not," Gendry said fiercely, almost before thought, and then stopped because the truth had leapt faster than his tongue. He felt the bite of the words he would not say. It was a bite he knew. The hammer's face finding purchase on a stubborn piece that would not move unless struck just so. He did not call her mother. He called her my lady, and when she spoke to him in the yard about the weather or how Bran should hold his bow or whether the last harvest had been fair, Catelyn asked questions like a woman counting spearheads. He was stiff as a new shoe. She was not cruel. She was courteous. But there was a place between cruelty and courtesy that was colder than the heart of winter. Robb, on the other hand, made siblings of everyone within a mile of his laughter. He sparred with Gendry in the yard, took him down twice with speed and once with a trick Theon had taught him that was all hips and insolence, and then laughed when Gendry knocked him on his back with a gripped hammer that slid across the snow. He set a hand to Gendry's neck when he had drunk too much at a harvest feast and told him he had thrown up in the same place once when he was 12 and the snow had been dirty and he had sworn Bran to secrecy with a silver stag. He asked him how the South tasted and if the women in King's Landing had hair for days and if the wine was as good as men said. Gendry told him what he knew, that the city was too many things at once, like or that had not been sorted, and it stank, and there were men who laughed with no teeth. Theon Greyjoy took to him as a man takes to a stone that troubles his boot. He poked at him with words, with a grin, with the careless cruelty of the comfortable. "You look like a smith's boy I once knew," Theon said one morning as Gendry pumped the bellows. "He was shorter, though. If you are to be Lord Stark's little find, you could at least be as pretty as his girls." He said it in front of two kennelmen, and they snorted. Gendry looked at him, slow and dark, and the next time they were in the yard with gritted earth beneath their boots, he swiveled low out of a swing, took Theon in the thigh with the butt of a stave, and sent him sprawling. Robb laughed so hard he split his lip and regretted it the moment a drop hit the snow like a bright berry. Winterfell turned. Ravens came and went, crows against a gray sky. The maester's ravens brought letters that smelled of candle smoke and the clean dryness of vellum rolled and unrolled. Ned's writing hand came steady, a dry river tracing lines of duty and danger. There were times, reading between the tight strokes, when Catelyn came to the godswood and did not kneel. She stood with her hands folded and stared as though the face carved in the weirwood might change if she looked long enough. Robb grew quieter and reeled his laughter in like a line to keep it from tangling. Bran climbed and fell and climbed again, a stubbornness like iron set in him. Rickon cried because the wind bit him and because his father's name in a letter sounded wrong. Arya wrote as a boy would, short and blunt and unwilling to be caught. I am learning to water dance. Sansa's letters were right as a seam of fine or a smith would envy, filled with ladies and songs, the words swollen with a court's easy lies. The letter that broke the quiet came on a day of brittle cold and a sky like beaten steel. It was not a letter. It was the absence of a voice that had been present for so long it had become part of the wall. Eddard Stark had been taken in the Red Keep. Sansa was in the Queen's hands. Arya was missing. The lines smudged where the ink had smeared the maester's fingers. Vayen Poole, the steward, had been put out, the household broken like a dropped plate. Robert Baratheon lay dying from a boar's tusks. The letters were as clean as a cut sinew. Catelyn did not weep where they could see. She set the paper aside and sat in the chair by the fire and folded her hands until the nails bit crescent moons into her palms. Robb stood in the doorway with his hair rucked wrong and said, too loudly, "We will call the banners. If I were a wolf, I'd howl until the crags fell." "You are not," Catelyn said, her voice low, and she looked not at her son but at the flames. "You are my son. We will speak to our men." So they did. The great hall heard one of its old songs, the one with oak in the melody. Banners unrolled from their perches, stag and galloping horse and flayed man and merman and the sunburst of Karstark, the gray pike of Tallheart, a shadow of trout. The men came with hoarfrost in their beards and vows on their tongues. Winterfell filled with the sound of steel bent and checked and sharpened. Gendry slept less. His shoulders ached in a way that threatened to teach him a new kind of posture. He beat out spearheads and mended mail and set new shoes on 100 hooves. He was a boy, but the hammer made men, and a man needed to be made quickly when war was a thought moved to deed. Robb stood before his men with Catelyn at his side and Ser Roderick behind him like a mountain of patience made flesh, and he said the things that needed saying. He did not say father. He said Lord Stark. He said treason. He did not say Joffrey. He said the boy. Gendry listened with sweat flipping down his spine like a line of ants and knew a thing he had not had words for before. He knew where to put the part of himself that had grown in that alley of Tobo Mott's behind the bellows and above the anvil, into the arm that swung, into the heat, into the weight. He had no lords to call his own when he was born. Now he had them, and they had a war. The night before the banners left, Robb came to the forge. The yard was quiet as a breath held. The snow was piled along the walk, clean and indifferent. Catelyn had gone to pray. Bran slept with summer sprawled like a shadow at his side. Theon was in the hall, drinking and making up songs that agreed too much with themselves. Robb leaned against the lintel and watched Gendry polish a helm till it reflected the forge light like a pale sun. "Come with me," Robb said, as if offering warm bread to a friend. "Lady Catelyn wants me here," Gendry said, neither bitter nor grateful. He had learned that Catelyn Stark did nothing without reason, and her reasons were a kind of map he was learning to read. She wanted him with Bran and Rickon for the same reason she had asked Mikken to teach him to shoe a horse in winter, because a house must be able to stand when the roof groaned. Robb nodded, the admission sitting up between them like a third body. "She said you were to keep the hearth hot," he said, "and the little ones unharmed." "I can swing a hammer," Gendry said. Robb smiled. "Aye, so swing it where the blows matter most." They clasped arms, and Gendry held the air of Winterfell's wrist and felt bone and tendon and impatience there, and it felt like holding a rope that snaked away into the dark. The next morning, before dawn had lifted its face from the wolf-white fields, the banners went out with their horns and hoofbeats, and Winterfell was left with its old bones and new boys. Weeks slid with the weather. News came like bits of broken iron. Sharp, ill-fitting, in need of a file if they were to make a thing of them. There were small victories spoken of, fast as the breath made from them in telling, and there were defeats that sank at once as if the men did not wish to make words for them. Gendry worked. He shod Ser Roderick's mare so well the old man patted her flank under the line of grey in his beard and said, "Good lad," in a tone that was not the charity the words sometimes sheltered but true coin given and received. He fixed the hinge on the gate to the crypts. He let Bran watch him twist wire and set rivets and told him you learned the metal by the way it flinched when the hammer came in too fast. He picked Rickon up laughing when the child flung himself into drifts and came up shrieking because the world had swallowed him to the chin. Theon Greyjoy went with Robb. Winterfell breathed easier. It was a small cruelty to think it, and Gendry did not bother to gild it in nicer words. When the Ironborn returned, it was like a shadow doubled. They came with the sea still in their hair, water in their eyes that had not dried, a stink of fish and salt and someone else's grief. They came up like a fog you do not see at first and then find yourself drowning in. Theon Greyjoy rode at their head in the grey cloak of a silent lord, and the men at the gate let him through because they had known him since he was a boy and because the river does not start screaming when it freezes. It just stops moving. They had the walls before the house knew to wake. Gendry came to the yard with a hammer in his fist and ash in his hair from the way sleep had taken him by the forge. He found the Ironborn already between him and any door that mattered, axes gleaming where the snow had polished them. Ser Roderick was not there. He had ridden out with 10 men to catch a band of raiders, and the raiders had become an army that had become Theon while the gate hinges had still been warm from his hands. "Put it down!" An Ironborn soothed in a voice that made Gendry's lip curl. "Little lord." Laughter flickered around the yard like a series of knives being stroked in a practiced hand. It shocked him how quickly the words had changed him. "Little lord," said the man who would take his teeth if he turned his head wrong. Gendry felt the weight of the hammer's head and thought absurdly of dates scribbled in a maester's book. A man's life measured by hammer strokes and snows remembered. He did not put the hammer down. He swung it. The man's forearm went the wrong way with a sound the Ironborn made a good clear oath to. Blood splashed the clean yard snow and sank with a sullen eagerness. Then it was 2 men, then 3. One took him in the back before he could turn. He went to one knee and there was a boot, and then the hammer was out of his hand and he was looking up at Theon Greyjoy, who held a blade in a grip that shook only faintly. "Ah," Theon said almost gently. He had a cut under his eye, new and raw. He looked tired, as if the inside of his mouth tasted of rotten fish. "I wondered if you'd make me kill you." "You can try." Gendry's mouth tasted of pennies. "Oh, I can try," Theon said. And that was the first true thing Gendry had ever heard him say. He did not die because he was not important enough to kill and too important to lose. Theon had the boys or wanted to have them, and Gendry was a name in the house now. Winterfell Smith, Lord Stark's son, the boy with arms like tree trunks and a face like weather. The Ironborn took him and 3 others and made a knot of them, and then Theon made a speech that was all hard horizons and no rivers, all pride and no shore, and Gendry counted the men around them and the doors and the windows and thought of hinges and bars and the way with splinters in cold. They found Osha in the kitchens. No one ever looked for Osha where she did not put them. She walked with the careful stride of a woman who had carried something far and would carry it again. She had been a captive once and then something else, something the house needed and was still deciding to name. She saw Gendry's eyes and shook her head and set a loaf down and went to stir a stew with the same expression. Later he felt her beside him in the night like a presence in a dream, the brush of air that follows any living body. She murmured without moving her lips. He felt the shape of her words against his ear more than he heard them. "The crypts," she was saying. "The old gods keep them as they do the woods. You can hide a boy where the dead stare straight through him and see only their own long sleep." She had the keys because maesters carry trust on rings as much as they do a gate. Maester Luwin bled his trust for them and gave the last of it with eyes that were tired but not hopeless. Bran went down into the stone world with Rickon swallowing his own noise like a brave, with Osha behind and hotter before, with Summer and Shaggy Dog moving like black water around them. Gendry waited until the Ironborn had spent their first day's hope and their first day's rage and had sat, as men do, to eat stew with their knees out. And then he took 2 boys of the yard with him and went to the place where the gate's bar was a hair's breadth shy of the right side. Mikken refused to turn. The smith had Theon's grey cloak in his hand, and he pulled at it and spit in his eye and did not look away when the Ironborn held him. Theon, who had eaten at this hearth, who had tried to steal kisses in the kitchen when the lights were low, put a blade through Mikken like he had a list and that act was on it, and Gendry felt something inside him harden and then crack. The iron smell of blood flooded his careful world of coal and quench. It blacked the edges. He bellowed and broke the first man's jaw as he reached for Mikken's body. Theon's second-in-command had to hit him hard enough that his ears sang for an hour like a struck kettle. When the sound faded, Mikken was gone and the black anvil looked like a tomb. Theon paraded 2 little charred bodies in the yard that evening, and there was a sound then that had lived in Winterfell since the first Stark had laid his bones in the stone below. It did not want to be heard. It had been silent for centuries. It came up out of grown men like vomit. It bit the lids of women's eyes. Gendry stood there, blood from his scalp drying in the wind, and did not look away. He held the little shape of Rickon in his mind and the sharper lines of Bran, their mouths deep with the sleep of the crypts in his memory, and he held them there as if they were steel to be shaped. He did not know the truth of those bodies, not for certain. He knew the lies of iron, though. They had their own scent, and Theon wore it now like a lord wears a cloak he knows does not fit. When the bastard of Bolton came, Winterfell felt the cold of a deeper river, one that did not thaw. Theon had sought help of men who smelled of old blood and cured leather and something like stale rage. They came up out of the north like a disease that liked the chill. The bastard smiled with his mouth and not his eyes and called himself friend before he showed his teeth. He helped Theon hold the castle and then took the castle from him. He put men to the torch as if he felt warmer that way. He burned the hall because fire praised him where men would not. Gendry ran in smoke. He picked up a boy who had no name yet to the house and put him out the postern and into the arms of a woman who had 2. He took a bucket line and made it a line that carried old men instead of water. He found Maester Luwin in the gods' wood on the quiet, clean snow and did not cry then, though later he would like the feeling of weeping, of it like a thaw. He did not see Theon again after the hall fell, only at the edge of his thought, the shape of him made small by smoke. He left with 20 souls, and that was all, and that was more than most. They went to the woods. The air stung. The trees were taller because they held lives. Gendry cut spruce boughs with a borrowed axe and built a shelter that looked like a small boy's idea of a lord's hall and kept fear dry under it. He kept a little anvil in the camp like a heart. At night, when the cold crawled like a careful hand and tried to root in the bones of children, he let the hammer fall just enough to make a sound. It was a sound like a heartbeat, like speech, like a promise spoken without words. The iron answered him as it always had. It knew how to be shaped, and shaping it kept his own shape certain. When at last they came not to White Harbor, too far, too full of men who counted, but to a rude hall on the rills kept by a woman who had once been nursed by a wet nurse at Winterfell's kitchens and had never forgotten the taste of the milk herself, the villagers took them in and made of them something like a household. It had fences and hens and sleep. It had a stove that burned slow as a story. The woman had the good sense to put Gendry's anvil under her own eaves. The hammer gave word to the settlement that a different kind of man had come to stay, one who could make a bar hold and a shoe fit without throwing the horse's gait to the bad. Sometimes men rode through, and sometimes none did for days, and then one night a stranger came in with hair like wet straw and eyes set too close. He sat by the fire and said that Robb Stark had been murdered at a wedding with music playing. He said it easy. Gendry rose and went outside and put his forehead to the stove's cold outer stones, because he needed a thing that would not move as he tried to keep his breath from becoming something wrong. The woman who kept the hall came and put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing. When he went back inside, there was a new line drawn in his face, one he had not earned by swinging for coin or by the Ironborn's boots. He kept to the anvil more after that because grief can be turned into shape if you heat it right. He made small knives, and he set points and taught boys to hold a stick as if it were a spear. He stood up at a little table in a hall that smelled of tallow and peat and told them that Lord Robb had laughed like a man who had never done wrong and had done wrong anyway by going to a hall where men did not love him, and that the North remembered not because it had good memory but because its forgetfulness killed it. The boys did not understand all of that, and the men only some, and the women understood more than the men. That was enough. They began to think of themselves as a corner of the North, and Gendry found his own face changing in the sight of their eyes. It made him uncomfortable, as a good leather will when it first sits in the hand. He did not put it down. He went to the wall in the end because the wind blew that way, and because the ravens began to talk of dead things in the woods with voices that made the hair on a man's arms rise like wheat in a gust. The rills were 1,000 brittle stories away from the wall, and each was a day's hard ride. He went with 2 lads who were either brave or stupid and were in any case too young to be sent alone. The world became emptier as they rode. The trees stood further apart like guests leaving a hall where the music had soured. Castle Black lay like kneecaps in the snow when you first saw it. It had no grace. It was ugly and stubborn, and something about it had the same kind of beauty as a woman's plain bread that filled a man more than any sugared pastry in King's Landing. The men at the gate looked like the wall itself, being stripped to use. They took him in and gave him thin stew and a bench by an honest fire. The smith at the wall had 1 arm. Gendry watched him set a pot to boil and rebuild a pair of ice shoes that looked like the jaws of some northern creature. Watched him curse a rivet without any superstition under his breath. When the man looked up, Gendry felt as if he had come to a river and seen himself in it as he had been when he first came to Mott's. "You're too big to be a boy," the man said with a laugh rasped short by the cold. "And you smell of coal, not like these lads who think you shoe a horse by speaking kindly to it and blowing in its ear. I am Donal Noy. They call me Smith, and I don't argue." "You, Gendry," he said, and there was something about the way Noy's eyes widened and then narrowed that made Gendry set his jaw as if a blow might be coming. "Say it again," Noy said, and his voice had moved down a register into seriousness. "Gendry, Noy said, and then he did a strange thing. He laughed, but it sounded like mourning. He wiped his mouth with the stump of his arm like men do when they must do something with their hands. "I forged a certain man's hammer once," he said. "When men struck that hammer against armor, I felt it in my arm for a week after, I swear. The weight of it was a song in me. It hit like a mountain falling. You are the man's boy, I think, unless the gods like a jest too keenly." Gendry sat back as if the bench had slid. "I am Eddard Stark's son," he said, because it had become easier to say than to think of what lay under it. "But I have my mother's face." "You have your father's," Noy said, not unkindly. "And I do not mean Lord Stark. He took you in and good for him. But no forge earns its iron. It only changes it. You were a bar before you ever saw his face." Gendry tasted ash. He tasted winter air. He did not taste wine. He had not drunk wine like a king. He thought of Robert's laughter in the hall, of the way his head had tipped back as if he could pour joy down his throat and fill himself without measuring any. He thought of how men had died so that laughter might run down the throat easier. He did not know what to put on that anvil. "Lord Commander Snow will want to see you," Noy said after a while, as if he knew that one short answer and the silence that followed might be the shape of a great thing. "He will be a Stark in truth if not in name to you, I think. He knows the weight of duty, that one." Jon stood taller than Gendry remembered boys standing. The wall had lengthened him, pulled the fat of childhood from his face and set a harder light at his cheekbones. He looked as if he had been carved by weather. His eyes were dark and steady. When he held out his arm, Gendry took it, and it felt like blood finding an old channel it had been diverted from. "Welcome," Jon said, and the word had weight in this ugly place. "I heard you were here. I asked prayers once for the safety of a brother who was not blood to me. It is good to have another." "I made you hinges once," Gendry said, and it sounded foolish in a hall that smelled of old sweat and old snow. But it was true, and the saying of a true thing has its own weight. Jon smiled. It changed his face and made him younger in a way that hurt to see. "We need hinges," Jon said gravely, "and arrows. and hands, and a heart that doesn't flinch. Will you give us some of those for a little while? I'll give you all except the heart, Gendry said. That is promised elsewhere. That is the best of men, Jon said. The ones whose hearts are promised and who work anyhow. Gendry knew a battle was coming because the birds stopped singing not in the woods but in men's mouths. They closed them around the fear and spoke less. The wildlings came like a storm that had learned to ride. They were many. They were hungry. They came like a force of the world, like a winter that did not care what men had named their sheep. Gendry shod worn horses and ran sweat ducks under armor and set arrowheads that gleamed like a knife's promise. He slept 3 hours and ate with his eyes closed. When the horn sounded in the night, he tucked a hammer in his belt and went up on the wall. He was like standing on the spine of the world. The wind tried to clean the bones of his face. The white below looked soft. It would break you as quickly as stone. He saw men moving like dark marks on a blank page, and the archers let fly, and the sound the arrows made was the thin song of a string struck and then the dull thud of the world agreeing to the shape men wanted of it. Gendry used the hammer when the first of the laddermen topped the ice, when the fight became immediate, intimate, a matter of what your arm could do and the width of your stance. He saw Jon move like a thought before the word formed and knew that the boy he had not known in Winterfell had done the work required of him to become this. Donal Noy died where the ice narrowed, holding the gate with his one arm and his pride. Later, when the dead were counted, Gendry stood by the forge and scoured his hammer and did not look up for a long time. Jon came and leaned against the door and did not speak. There are silences that are prayers and require no gods. When the storm had passed and the thing left behind was not the same world, Stannis Baratheon came north. He came like something born of grief and salt, hungry for a shape the world would not provide. He came with his queen's men and his red woman and the smell of a court that had learned to wear hair shirts like jewels. He came in black and blue and justice, and when he saw Gendry in the yard he stopped and looked as if a story had put itself under his nose for him to read. "What are you?" he asked, already suspicious of the answer. "A smith," Gendry said. "A liar," Stannis corrected, and his face did not move even when he said the most insulting things. "You are my brother's get. It is writ under your skin. You have his set. You have his ungovernable cast." Gendry went still. He had always known to go still when a blow was coming. "You would have me for it? I would have only the law," Stannis said. "And the law will not have you. I will not see my brother's bastards raised up. It makes bad law." He seemed about to turn away. "But neither will I see you burned for what you are, as some would. Keep to your Envil. That is what the world made you for." There was a twitch at his temple, something like pity, something like a memory. "And keep away from the Red Woman." Gendry did more than keep away. He left the wall as soon as the Watch's laws permitted it. He rode south again with the knowledge of the world pushed into him, made a shape there like old bone healed badly after a break that could not be set. He went back to the rills first because duty requires you to show your face to those you promised it to. He found boys he had taught to hold spears holding infants under their armpits and making them squeal. He found the woman's stove warm. He fixed a gate. He learned to bake a coarse loaf that did not poison anyone and felt more pride in it than he expected. Word came that a girl wolf had been seen at the Twins and then at the Trident. Word came that the Freys had choked on their own bones, one by one, slow as gods who have learned grudges do. Word came from White Harbor, where men wore green and silver and ate fish stewed in milk and had held their patience like a man holds breath underwater, long enough to make others think he is dead. Word came that the Boltons held Winterfell and that the snow came hard and wet and would not stop. Word came that the North remembered like an old scar remembers rain. It itched, then it opened. Gendry went where the words pulled him, as iron is pulled to a lodestone. He was one man and his hammer and a horse with a long winter coat. He met men in the woods who wore no sigil, only rags, and called themselves by the old house's names like a prayer. He met a boy in a leather jerkin who had taken a flaying knife from a dead man and held it with loathing and used it anyway. He met a woman with gray hair and ice-blue eyes who had once handed out bread at Winterfell's kitchen door and now handed out little knives and news. He became part of a rumor. A black-haired Northman who swung a hammer like something more than muscle moved it, who could make a spear bite when the haft was just a branch and the head a bit of scrap, who called himself son to a dead lord and did the dead man's house proud. They came not in banners but in bits. They came like a storm that decides to be made up of many little winds. When at last they stood within sight of Winterfell again, the castle lay hunched under winter like a wolf under a burden. Its scars were plain even under the armor of snow. Smoke leaked from it like a sign of a wound badly set. The bastard of Bolton had salted the ground with men who would be remembered only by the quality of their cruelty. He had filled the hall with a kind of mirth that had no air in it. Gendry crouched behind a white boulder and looked at his father's house, because that is what it had become, and felt how the cold settled in his chest like questions. The men beside him shifted like animals in burrows, making themselves small enough to weather the coming thing. His horse nosed his shoulder. He set his hand against the long muzzle and thought of the first time he had seen Winterfell, how his mouth had made a sound of awe without his consent. Awe came again now, darker, and it moved over into something else that men make songs about only if they survive. The plan was the kind men make when they do not have enough men and cannot afford to admit it. They would light fires where there ought to be none and put men in walls where only shadows should be. They would pull at the threads of fear until a man not used to mending would rip his own shirt to pieces. The snow was their ally and their worst enemy both. It would swallow noise and men. It would give and then take without giving back. Gendry did not speak much in the council, because that was not his shape. He said, "The south gate has a bar I set that will not lift quick in a freeze. Strike it where the wood has a knot. It will crack." He said, "Men sleep where the stone remembers fire. They are lazier than you'd think once they believe themselves safe." When at last the word went down the line, he touched the hammer's head with his thumb and felt the faint crust of old blood in the seam. He had scrubbed it and it never all came away. He lifted it and thought of Mikken, whose apron had still been clean even as he died. He thought of Theon's mouth when he had said, "I can try." He thought of Jon's eyes on the wall, dark and steady and full of a fire that would not go out even if the world ended around it. The snow took the first bodies quietly. There is a sound a man makes when he dies in winter that is not like summer dying. It is as if the cold reaches in and closes a thing already half asleep. Gendry swung, and when the hammer hit, it felt like two statements agreeing. The one the metal made with every stroke he had ever given it, the one his bones made when they said yes to the shape of duty. Men fell and Gendry hauled a gate bar with the help of a boy who had no beard but had named himself Serwyn for the night, and the knot split where he had said, and the gates opened on a rush of cold air as if the castle were drawing a deep breath. Inside, fear made smoke. The bastard's men came like roaches under a lifted log, scuttling blind and angry. Gendry found the great hall as it had been remade wrong. Tapestries of skins, laughter where prayer had once been. He saw the dogs before he saw the man. They were lean and certain. The man moved down the steps with the same crooked grace. He had a cloak trimmed in something that had been alive once and had not died easy. He smiled, and culture hung on him like a fine shirt worn too often by a man who sweats. "Which of you is the wolf?" Ramsay asked, amused by his own question. "Which wants his name in the song?" Gendry felt something in him settle. A song was not why he was here. He swung the hammer anyway, because there are some men you cannot speak to in any other language. The head connected with the table as Ramsay moved aside, and the crack of the wood was a sound that made the men around them flinch as if the hall itself remembered something and did not like it. Then men fell on men and there was no speech worth making for a while. He saw Theon in the middle of it, thin as a starving thing, his hair shorn wrong, his eyes blown. He moved like a man in a dream he did not like. For a heartbeat, the chaos eddied around them and Gendry and Theon stood in a little eye of it, the world screaming elsewhere. Theon looked at him as a beaten dog looks, with a terror so complete it has no room left for anger or anything else. "I am sorry," Theon said. and the words came out in a whisper so raw it hurt to hear. "I am sorry. I was a boy." Gendry looked at him. He thought of boys and the weapons they are given without knowing the names of them. He thought of Mikken, of Bran's narrow back moving into the crypts, of Rickon's hand sweaty in a man's palm. In his hand was a hammer, and Theon's throat would break under it as easily as the knot had given under the bar. And there would be a justice there that a certain part of the world would recognize as such and nod to. He lowered the hammer. "Then be a man now," he said. "Fetch what's left of your courage and pay a part of what you owe." Theon blinked, and then something that had been held at a great cost inside him cracked and let out a little light. He nodded like a boy, and then, somehow, he moved like a man. When the hall fell and the men who had not fallen fled, it was Theon who knew which door would jam in the snow and stay shut so men could not get their dogs through. It was Theon who knew where the bastard kept the keys that would open the last locked thing between them and whatever lived through the night. He bled, and he did not run, and when he fell, he did not try to lessen the weight of him hitting the ground. He let it be enough to be there and to have done a thing that might count. Morning did not come, not in any brightness. The snow had not stopped. It had merely grown bored with novelty and settled in to do the long work of erasing and remaking. The men in the yard were old as trees, and their breath hung like banners that no one had the heart to lift. The hall smelled of smoke and old meat and a kind of victory that was modest, as if it understood its own small place in the world. They took down what the bastard had hung and left nothing in the hall that would remind the stone of shame. They brought the dead to the gods' wood, though the gods had their own ideas about the order of things now. The heart tree's face did not change. It never did. That was comfort and insult both. Gendry stood with his hammer and felt the oddest thing. For the first time since the night in King's Landing when a lord had said "son" to him with a weight on it, he felt as if his feet had found a proper floor under them. He went down to the crypts alone. He carried a lantern and his own breath for company. The cold there was not the cold of the yard. It was an old cold, a good cold, and it smelled of stone that had done its work without complaint for 1,000 years. Ned Stark lay with a stone wolf at his feet and a sword on his knees. Gendry set the lantern at the foot of the tomb and looked at the face that had been carved with a kind of love too moderate to be easily seen. He wanted to say father. He wanted to say Robert. He said neither. He did not think any of the dead preferred flattery to truth. "I did not break," he said, and his voice sounded very loud and then very small against the stone. "I made things and I did not break. That is what I had to offer." It was not a prayer. It was the account given at the end of a day's work. He stood a while longer because it felt right to stand in company that did not expect him to be other than he was. Then he set the hammer against the tomb, gently, the way a man sets a cup by a sleeping child. The iron was cold enough to bite his palm when he lifted it back. He turned and climbed the steps. Winterfell was a wound and a hearth. The men who had taken it would not hold it without help. Gendry knew the shape of that truth instinctively, the way you know the shape of tools in the dark. But it had been taken, and that mattered. White Harbor sent messages that spoke of ships and oaths. The Umbers sent messages that were not a hand but a grim humor. The Karstarks were a fight inside their own hall as much as a house. Jon was on the wall still, a word away and a world. Sansa was a rumor wrapped like bread to keep it from becoming stale. Arya was a wolf in men's nightmares and maybe a girl in a cart if the stories remembered how to be themselves. In the yard, the snow fell steady as a whitesmith's shavings. Men dragged timbers and set new beams where the old had burned. The women measured linen and cut it with care that was a kind of respect. The children were loud again, the way children are when danger has drawn its breath back and is listening before its next bite. Gendry put his anvil where Mikken's had stood. He had no right to it by blood or law. He took it anyway. He took it as a man takes a wife or a vow. He had earned it with work and loss and the shape he had hammered his heart into when there had been no one to hand him a better mold. People came to him as they always do to those who make and mend. They brought small needs and large ones dressed in modest clothes. They brought messages and rumors and hopes disguised as simple requests. He shot a horse for Sir Roger Riswell and set a point to a spear for a boy whose hand shook and reshaped a look a woman had for herself by mending the latch a door had broken and that had made her feel caught in her own hall. He made a little knife for a girl who had lost her mother's. He filed the blade dull because she was 7 and solemn and would not be told you cannot own a knife. He did not set a place on the anvil for another man to claim. He set a place at the table for guests. He sent riders out with food and small coins and the promise that no one would be turned away who did not use a door like a weapon. When the ravens came and spoke of a king of the north and of the wall needing men and of a lady returned whose hair glinted like copper under snow, when they spoke of things that had become songs while the men who were their subjects still scratched at the stubble on their cheeks and wondered what the day would bring in practicalities, Gendry lifted his head and listened. He heard the shape of the world in them now in a way he had not as a boy in King's Landing. He heard that men were learning to stand where they were put and not to run because the running was too expensive. The first night the hall was warm again and the table crowded. Catelyn Stark came to stand in the doorway. She had come north and south and north again, with grief braided through her hair so tightly it shone. There were other faces with her, and there were faces beloved and faces feared and one or two that made Gendry's heart go quiet for a single beat with a joy he did not dare name. Arya was a boy's shape in a girl's body still, her look as direct a blow as ever. Sansa was taller, her bearing a thing she had hammered with as much care as he had ever given a blade. They were alive. That was a thing. Catelyn came to Gendry at the far end of the hall where he sat with the men who swung their tools and not their titles. She did not ask him to rise. She did not ask him to bow. She put a hand on his shoulder and it was not light, but it did not press him down. "You have kept the hearth," she said, and the words were in her voice like warmth finally come to fingers that had gone too long without. "Thank you." He looked up at her, at the lines the world had carved there the way wind carves stone, and found there was nothing left of the old cold. He nodded, and the nod felt like a piece of something fitting into the right groove at last. Arya came and knocked his shoulder with her fist, grinning so hard it made his own face ache in answer. Sansa's eyes met his, and she nodded once, as if acknowledging that things made well cannot help but be beautiful. That night he went down alone once more to the crypts and stood at Eddard Stark's stone. He did not speak. He set a hand on the carving's knee and then went back up. On the steps he met Jon coming down, his hair damp with the snow's melt, his sword at his hip as if it were not weight but a reminder. "Brother," Jon said simply. "Brother," Gendry said back. They stood a while in the corridor where the stone held the day's warmth in pockets like a miser holds coin. They did not need to make a plan larger than the next day. There would be time for larger plans and so little time for small ones. Somewhere beyond the walls, in woods that had held men's fear and love both for longer than any song could afford to speak, wolves moved. Their cries came thin and wild and right. Gendry slept at last that night with the sound of them in his bones and the knowledge that while winter would not be kind, neither would he, to those who came to unmake what he had set his hands to. In the weeks that followed he taught Arya how to use the hammer as more than a thing to knock a hand back with. She took to it laughing, easy as if she were lifting a lark's song. He taught Sansa how to file a hinge smoothly so that the door does not squeal and betray a secret. Even ladies must learn what secrets can endure noise and which cannot. He taught boys to bend their knees and girls to thicken their palms, and he learned from women how to keep a stew from catching when the fire chose too much heat, and from old men how to set a fence deep enough the frost would not heave it out of the ground. Winter passed slowly the way age does in a man who has chosen to be patient. Spring would come, but it was not owed to them. They would have to make it. The gods kept their own counsel. Gendry kept the anvil. He set it to ring in the morning and in the evening, and when it rang the hall heard not merely the sound of a tool at work but the call to the shape a house takes when it decides to remain itself. One day, in a year's turn that would later be called by singers the year of the long night that did not end men but changed them, he stood in the godswood with his hands cracked and scabbed, and the sun found a way through the boughs and touched the cut on his knuckle so that it looked like fresh hear blood. Catelyn came and stood beside him, and then Jon, and then Arya and Sansa and Bran and Rickon as if they had never been anywhere else but dew and laughter and ghost and pain. They did not speak. They watched winter's light. It was narrow. It was sufficient. A raven came and went, and then another, and they spoke of kings and walls and the way the wind had changed. Gendry wiped his hands on his patched breeches and went back to the forge. He lifted the hammer and brought it down, and the sound went out into Winterfell and through its gates and into the fields where the snow was starting to crust. It went into the hearts of children who would remember it without knowing what they remembered. It went into the bones of men and women who had thought themselves too tired to do the work left them to do. The strike fell, and the second, and the third. It was not a song, and it was not a prayer. It was work, and it was love, and it was enough.